Hey, what's up everybody? It's JR here from HolyFaith Media. I wanted to come on today and talk about the Dialogue Mass. The Dialogue Mass is the form of low Mass that is used at most chapels of the Society of St. Pius X. If you've ever been to a Fraternity of St. Peter or an Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest or a Diocesan Tridentine low Mass, you'll notice a difference between that and the one used at the Society of St. Pius X. At the SSPX, they used the Dialogue Mass, which Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre approved in the early years of the founding of the Society of St. Pius X, and as the Mass centers and chapels expanded throughout the world, they continued to use the Dialogue Mass. Now, the Dialogue Mass began in the early part of the 20th century, and it began being used in Germany, if I'm not wrong. Although in English-speaking countries it never really caught on because most of the bishops were more conservative-minded. In the more progressive or so-called progressive countries such as France and Germany, the Dialogue Mass kind of took hold. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that in the Dialogue Mass, some of the parts that are said normally just by the priest and by the acolytes are said actually by the laity and the faithful that are assisting at Mass as well, such as the Confiteor, for example. Now, what got me thinking about this topic, or talking about this topic, is recently I went to a Fraternity of St. Peter young adults meeting, and there I met a couple of people who came to the meeting but had still not went to the Tridentine Latin Mass before. They've never attended. They came from other parishes and decided to join up with this youth group meeting. Well, a few days after, one of the gentlemen that I met there, really great guy, I saw him attend the Tridentine Latin Mass at the Fraternity of St. Peter Parish a few days later after he had went to this meeting. And I just remember thinking that, or it going through my mind, that the low Mass, when it's not a Dialogue Mass, would seem very bland. It would be hard to follow. And I would have to say that when you come from the Novus Ordo to a regular low Mass at a Fraternity of St. Peter Parish, it would seem drastically different and probably a bit boring in comparison to the Novus Ordo Mass. I personally prefer the Dialogue Mass. I think that it was, although it was a development and there probably was a few bad forces behind it, it was a positive in the life of the church. And if I'm not wrong, it was Pope Pius XI who approved it to be used, at least in certain circumstances. And then in the 1950s, I think it was Pius XII that gave it wider permission. I could be wrong on some of those facts, so correct me if I'm wrong. But the Dialogue Mass, in my opinion, you feel much more involved in the Mass, and I think that at least the conservative-minded bishops at the Second Vatican Council, when they were thinking of reform, this is what they had in mind, is something similar to the Dialogue Mass, not a complete upheaval of the Mass altogether, as you saw with the liturgical reform in 1969 by Pope Paul VI. What some people may not be aware of is the fact that even the use of a missal that has both the Latin and the English, or whatever the vulgar tongue is of the people, even that is liturgical development that kind of grew up alongside of the Dialogue Mass. In fact, it was actually prohibited by the Vatican. If you go back to the late 19th century, it was actually prohibited to use a missal at Mass that had the liturgical translation in it. So some innovation is sometimes maybe even necessary. It's good reform, and I think that the movement towards the Dialogue Mass was a positive reform in the life of the church, because When you go to a low Mass at a Society of St. Pius X chapel, you feel much more engaged in the Mass, in my opinion, at least I do. And I understand that the Mass is not there just simply for entertainment. But I think it does help when you are actively participating in, at least in saying some of the responses. Whereas in a regular low Mass, you don't feel involved whatsoever. As I was watching this gentleman at his first Tridentine Mass, I just remember thinking that it would be so nice if he was there on a Sunday and his first experience with the Latin Mass was a solemn high Mass, or just a regular high Mass. Because with the responses, with the chants, it's so much more beautiful. But even without the chanting of the responses, the low Mass can be very beautiful too, but I definitely think that the dialogue Mass should be the norm across parishes of the FSSP, the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priests, and all the diocesan Masses. I think that people would come to appreciate the low Mass much more if the dialogue Mass were used. Now, I think that the reason that the SSPX uses it is because in France it had basically become the norm. And of course the SSPX started in France by French priests and by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who was French. And that is why generally you see it in North America, is because of the French background of the Society of St. Pius X. Let me know if you disagree in the comments below, but I definitely think that the dialogue Mass should be used more frequently. Thanks for watching, and that's all for now.